The Tornado Sprinkler Acolyte of Chayula build has been incredibly fun to put together, and it involves a playstyle where you're mostly dodging around and letting your tornadoes do all of the heavy lifting for you. But before we get into the mechanics of the tornadoes and the main combo that this setup is built around, let's briefly discuss the strengths and weaknesses of this build. On the strengths, this build requires very few buttons. You have access to quite a few extra skills that are used situationally, such as Convalescence and Refutation for a strong defensive combo, or Despair for extra single target damage. But once you're rolling with Archon of Chayula active, you pretty much just focus on dodging any incoming hits and let your tornadoes do the work. This also means that you don't have to aim, since the tornadoes just automatically target and move towards enemies to deal their damage. The spawning of many lingering tornadoes naturally makes this build very good for certain mechanics, such as Ritual. But it's also great at Abyss too, where the tornadoes are able to just sit on top of the Abyss and kill all of the monsters flooding out before they can do anything. Now for the build's weaknesses, the main one is that this is not a tanky build. You have a pretty low hit pool for an energy shield setup, and there's no avoidance, no block, no evasion. You're fully reliant on using dodge roll to avoid incoming damage, which is mostly fine as I mentioned because the tornadoes deal their damage while you're free to move around, but just know that you can't afford to stand still and face tank anything unless you have the Refutation buff active. On top of that, this build isn't the fastest for map clearing. There's not too much room to scale movement speed, and the tornadoes themselves are quite slow. Lastly, the required gear for this setup doesn't leave much room to scale item rarity. You can get it in a few places, but you won't be able to get that much in total. Okay, let's get on to the core mechanics of this build. The primary interaction here is that of the tornadoes spawned by the Archon of Chayula skill, combined with the Molten Shower skill that's triggered from the unique mace Brutus Lead Sprinkler. These tornadoes move around and deal attack damage, and when they hit, this counts as a hit with the weapon, which triggers Molten Shower. This means that we can almost entirely bypass the usage of normal mace abilities and just let the tornadoes do their thing. Now I say almost here because I do still make use of Molten Blast, but this is purely for glory generation. The Archon of Chayula skill is a glory skill. It requires 100 glory to use, and this is built by hitting enemies with chaos damage or inflicting chaos damage over time debuffs. However, something important to mention here is that the tornadoes spawned by Archon of Chayula are technically a separate skill, and this means that their hits can also generate glory, and whilst you can't generate glory whilst the Archon buff is actually active, this does mean that any lingering tornadoes from the last cycle can build glory for the next. And there will be many lingering tornadoes because we have a lot of skill effect duration scaling which allows them to last for a long time. In maps with lots of monsters, this means you literally don't need to use anything between uses of Archon of Chayula, because your tornadoes will immediately build enough glory to use the skill again to begin creating new tornadoes. Sometimes though, you will need to build the glory manually, and I use Molten Blast for that purpose with a support gem setup that's entirely designed to build as much glory as quickly as possible, which I'll go over in the skills and gems section later in the video. However, there is still a missing piece of the puzzle, which is the Amulet Anoint, Dominion. See, being an Archon skill, the Archon of Chayula has a 20-second recovery period by default after the buff comes to an end. This means that normally, you'd be unable to use the skill again until the recovery period expires. But there's a very powerful Anoint only notable called Dominion, which entirely removes the recovery period at the cost of some Archon buff effect. And this is what enables us to chain the use of Archon of Chayula back to back. Alright, so that's the core mechanics of the build, but what about the scaling? By stacking strength, we gain a huge amount of flat fire damage added to attacks from the Brutus Lead Sprinkler unique modifier. Note that this is a global modifier, so by using 2 of these maces, we're getting all of that added damage for all of our attacks. Then we're using Iron Grasp, which is a unique body armor that provides 2 keystone-like effects, Iron Grip and Iron Will. Together, these provide 1% increased projectile attack damage and 1% increased spell damage per 2 strength, at the cost of losing strength's inherent life scaling. And by using Crown of Eyes, we can make the spell damage increase also apply to attacks, which means that both keystones combined grant a huge amount of increased damage to Molten Shower, which is a skill that deals projectile attack damage and is the primary damage dealer in this build. Now, this is an Acolyte of Chayula build, and we are of course making use of Into the Breach. This skill spawns remnants which are guaranteed to be the purple ones due to our Ascendancy choice, and thanks to some investment into remnant pickup range, we can easily maneuver to obtain a large amount of stacks at any time, providing a huge amount of damage gained as extra chaos. We're also making use of the original Sin unique ring to convert the flat added fire damage into chaos damage, and this combined with the Archon buff effect that provides more chaos damage and a chance to inflict Withered to make targets take increased chaos damage means that this build is able to absolutely melt anything it comes across. Okay, so that's the offensive scaling, but what about defenses? Since Iron Grasp removes our ability to scale life via strength, we're making use of Black Scythe Training, which is a timeless keystone granted by the Heroic Tragedy Jewel when it's in the name of Varana. The number or the seed on this jewel does not matter, only the name, and this grants energy shield scaling based on strength, allowing us to get a reasonable hit pool with just a few pieces of gear that provide a good amount of energy shield. Now, part of that strength scaling comes from the use of Astramentis, which provides a huge amount of attributes. The strength, of course, is what we're really after here, but the intelligence and dexterity are not wasted either, as we're using a lot of green support gems in this build, and we're also using a high-level Blasphemy and Despair, which require a large chunk of intelligence that we wouldn't have otherwise. Now, one problem that I encountered when putting this build together was the lack of resistances on the necessary uniques, leaving little room to cap them out. However, this is achieved via the use of 3 Grand Spectrum Sapphires, which each grant a default of 18% to all elemental resistances, which can be improved to provide even more with quality and corruption outcomes. Editing Dreamcore here. The price of Grand Spectrum Sapphire Jewels has gone up massively in the last 3 or 4 days whilst making this video, and this is no longer a cost-effective way to solve resistances. If you cannot afford 3 of these jewels, here's what to do instead. Use crafted energy shield boots instead of Decree of Flight. This will provide you additional room for resistance modifiers on the suffixes. Your focus on these boots should be movement speed first, then resistances, then energy shield. Then, with the 3 open jewel slots that you have due to not using Grand Spectrums, you should make use of any jewels that you can get your hands on that have corrupted resistance enchantments. These can roll up to 10% each of fire, cold, or lightning resistance, and if you can get it alongside other useful modifiers such as movement speed, or skill effect duration, or area of effects, then go for those. Otherwise, just focus on the resistances first to get them capped out or as close to capped out as possible. And lastly in this section, I'll mention Decree of Flight, which is a unique pair of boots that I've opted to use in this build. This one is optional, and you can choose to use a crafted pair of boots if you want to, and there are upsides and downsides to either choice. Decree of Flight makes your dodge roll faster and provides a guard buff based on missing energy shield when dodging. This works really well with the playstyle of this build, because you end up dodging a lot and the guard can buy time for ES recharge to begin. But you can also use crafted energy shield boots if you wish, which will allow you to obtain much more energy shield overall, and additionally you can use the suffixes for resistances to alleviate pressure on other gear slots. Okay, so we've just covered the unique items and the mechanics that make up this build, but let's briefly go over the few pieces of crafted gear that we're using. These are our gloves, belt, and ring. The resistances on these pieces do not need to be exact, they just need to be balanced out along with your use of runes to cap out your resistances. However, the most significant stats to be obtained from these pieces is as much energy shield as possible from the gloves and the belt. Note that the energy shield modifier on the belt is exclusive to breach crafting. Other than that, you're looking for strength and all attributes. Note that intelligence gloves cannot naturally roll either, But the primary focus on the gloves should be the prefixes, and squeezing as much energy shield out of them as possible, since this is where most of it comes from for this build. The ring is used first and foremost to cap out any remaining missing resistances, and beyond that, the most important stats on here are of course the strength and all attributes. The Remnant effect modifier is a small damage boost, that one comes from Desecration Crafting, and it's an Aminamu modifier, so ensure that you make use of an Omen of the Liege with your Preserved Collarbone. Now, I will provide some crafting information for these items in the written guide, but just know that in Trade League it's almost always more efficient to buy a partially completed item and finish it yourself compared to crafting it from scratch or buying a completed item. For example, these gloves. I searched for a double tier 1 energy shield prefix along with an open prefix so that I could target the third ES prefix myself with Desecration Crafting. Doing it this way may take a few attempts, but the attempts are typically a lot cheaper than crafting it all yourself. Also, here's some examples of lower budget items for these slots. This is what you should be aiming for if you don't have as much currency to spend, and all of these items function perfectly well, and comparatively with the higher budget options, you don't gain a whole lot more and they're much more expensive to obtain, so make sure you're only going for these upgrades when you're looking to min-max the build. Now, the flasks in this build are not particularly important or impactful, and that's because we don't really spend much mana at all aside from using Despair, whilst we're primarily focused on energy shield over life. For that reason, I'm using Laviandra's Spirits as a passive boost to mana recovery, but you can absolutely use a normal mana flask instead if you want to, and I guarantee that you won't be clicking it very often at all, outside of perhaps a mana siphoner rare monster. The life flask slot is the Blood of the Warrior unique flask, with the most important aspects being that this flask doesn't stop while your life is full, and it also prevents rage from decaying during effect. This makes the use case for this flask simply maintaining your rage when moving between packs or when covering large areas with no monsters. The charms in this build are solving some of the weaknesses of being reliant on energy shield whilst also having a low life pool. Nascent Hope will remove freeze and also force recharge to begin when you get frozen, and Sanguis Harem will immediately remove bleeding when it's applied to you, preventing a long period of damage over time. But the most important of the charm slots is arguably the Fall of the Axe, which temporarily grants immunity to slows and also grants Onslaught for more speed after you get slowed. Getting slowed down is one of the primary threats that leads to dying, so this charm is extremely effective at helping to keep you alive. The weapon swap setup is simply a single target damage booster by making our Despair Curse much stronger. We're using Curse Carver for added levels to Despair, and Arvil's Wheel for some extra duration. Some points on the passive tree towards the bottom of the tree are allocated using Weapon Set 1 points, to make room for some curse-related nodes taken with Weapon Set 2 points up here. These nodes and the gem levels combined provide a huge boost to Despair, which covers a giant area and lasts around 30 seconds with Cursed Ground. Just make sure your Brutus Lead Sprinklers are in Weapon Set 1, and the Curse Carver setup is in Weapon Set 2. Additionally, make sure Despair is only set to be used with Weapon Set 2. Now, on the topic of the passive tree, let's cover the pathing and the Ascendancy choices. This is a strength stacking build, so pathing nodes taken for strength are actually very important. You'll notice that most of the tree is pathing. We're moving out of the monk starting area and immediately reaching the outer part of the tree to be able to move around the tree with the least points spent. However, we are taking some important wheels on the way. Some investment into Remnant is made here to ensure that we can maintain a large amount of extra chaos damage all the time. This build also invests quite heavily into skill effect duration, taking the Lingering Horror wheels here, the Preservation wheel here, and then down here we're also taking the Protraction wheel. At the top of the tree is where most of our scaling for the Archon of Chayula skill is coming from. Invigorating Archon provides a really strong boost while we have the Archon buff active, whilst Energizing Archon and Enduring Archon over here together make the Archon buff last much longer. Our Heroic Tragedy jewel is placed here to obtain Black Scythe training, providing the scaling for Energy Shield. And then further down here we're taking some boosted Glory Generation and a bonus to Maximum Rage. And as we move down towards the bottom of the tree, this is where most of our strength scaling is coming from. Titanic is taken here for 5% increased strength, and right at the bottom of the tree we're taking the Polymathy node for 7% increased attributes. We're also making use of 3 dual sockets here, each with a desecrated modifier for increased strength. And these combined with all of the flat strength coming from the pathing nodes, the Bruce strength wheel here, the beef notable taken up here, and of course all of the strength coming from our gear, makes up quite a lot of total strength scaling. This then plays into a few other important nodes here. Firstly, nimble strength, which ensures that we have enough accuracy to hit targets even when our tornadoes stray far from us. But more important than that is hefty unit, because it provides a huge amount of flat stun threshold based on our strength, which is very beneficial considering our low life total. Last but not least, some movement speed scaling is taken here, and leveling towards 100 I would continue to fill out this wheel here for faster movement. For the Ascendancy, we're taking Waking Dream for the Into the Breach skill, and choosing the Choice of Power node behind it to ensure that all flames of Chayula that are generated are purple ones for damage scaling. Then we're taking Chayula's Gift to be able to get to Archon of Chayula behind it. Note that Archon of Chayula is not unlocked by default, and must be unlocked by speaking to Chayula in the Monastery of the Keepers after completing the Breach questline. Now let's take a look at the setup for skills and support gems. Into the Breach is supported by Harmonic Remnants 2, Remnant Potency 3 and Katao's Rejuvenation, which provides us with bonus cooldown recovery rate when picking up Remnants, perfect for Molten Shower and a few other skills that we're using. Archon of Chayula is supported by Prolonged Duration 2, Chaos Attunement, Varana's Siege, Execute 2, and Close Combat 2. Note that Varana's Siege should be replaced with Magnified Area 2 in lower budget setups. Make sure Archon of Chayula is only enabled for your first weapon set, which should be the weapon set you have your Brutus Lead Sprinkler setup equipped in. Molten Shower is granted by each equipped Brutus Lead Sprinkler. You can upgrade the level of Molten Shower if you want to, by using a Perfect Flux to bring it to level 20. You can also add sockets to skills granted by items by using Jeweler's Orbs on the item, but note that both of these methods will not work if the item is already corrupted. I recommend prioritizing good corruption outcomes on your Brutus Lead Sprinklers over upgrading this skill to 20, but of course on very high budgets you can attempt to go for both. Note that I'm also using the Runeforged version of Brutus Lead Sprinkler, which has base fire damage, providing a small damage boost, and this can only be done on a non-corrupted item by using it in the Runeforging bench. Molten Shower is supported by Chaos Attunement, Retreat 3, Execute 2, Multi-Shot 2, and if you have a 6th socket, Close Combat 2. Molten Blast is used purely for glory generation. It's supported by Rapid Attacks 2, Nova Projectiles 1, Salvo, Magnified Area, and Poison 3. The Blasphemy setup is providing the Repulsion Curse Aura, and make sure that Blasphemy has 20 quality to save some spirit. This is supported by Chaos Attunement, Close Combat 2, Magnified Area 2, and Execute 2. Convalescence is supported by Cooldown Recovery 2, Prolonged Duration 2, Cool-Headed, and Rapid Casting 2. Refutation is supported by Cooldown Recovery 2, Prolonged Duration 2, and Rapid Casting 2. Lastly, Despair is supported by Aziri's Allure, Cursed Ground, Heightened Curse, Prolonged Duration 2, and Efficiency 2. Make sure Despair is only enabled for your second weapon set, which should be the weapon set you have your Curse Carver equipped in. Now, I did some testing with a setup that involved the use of a shield to be able to scale some avoidance for the build, since that's one of the biggest issues it has in juiced maps. For this, I made use of a Svalin unique shield with no damage taken from blocked hits, and I was surprised at the results. Dropping one of the Brutus Lead Sprinklers, you do lose a huge amount of damage, and this is very noticeable, there's no doubt about that. But if there's one thing that this build has in abundance, it's damage, so trading off damage for sustain in this case actually felt quite good. To do this, I used an Ox Idol in the Svalin to boost the base block, and dropped one of the extra jewel sockets on the tree to free up 3 points to spend into Wide Barrier. This brought my effective block chance to 63%, which is incredible considering the low investment. Beyond this, if you really wanted to invest into this setup, you could look for a Svalin with 2 sockets since the Ox Idol isn't limited to 1, and you could then also obtain increased block chance on your jewels to boost this up further. This block variant of the build is much more relaxed overall. You deal less damage, but you're also in significantly less danger of dying at any moment, and if you're playing this build and finding that it's a bit squishy, definitely consider giving this a try to see how you find it. Now for leveling, simply put, this is not a starter build. This is a build that you'll need to respec into once you have your full Ascendancy unlocked. And this is because Archon of Chayula is not unlocked on the Acolyte by default. To unlock it, you must speak to Chayula in the Monastery of the Keepers after having completed the Breach endgame questline. And if you do this as an Acolyte, he will grant you the means to become his Archon. If you're fresh to the league and you want to play this build, I recommend checking out the various monk guides on Mobalytics. There are several that provide very detailed walkthroughs for early leveling, but once again, I'd only recommend swapping to this build once you have your full 8 Ascendancy points unlocked, and you should have a decent budget too to be able to obtain some of the key items. Now over here on the Mobalytics guide, I have added some frequently asked questions, so you can go over these if you're having any issues. And there's a lot of information at the top of the page too about the weapon swap setup and the anoint and all of that. Now if you do have any other questions, be sure to post them below this video and I'll do my best to answer them. But that's going to be it for this video. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay tuned and stay safe.